So who was Pablo Picasso? We're going to take a moment here and investigate Pablo Picasso as an artist in terms of both of his work and the evolution of his work, as well as his changing ideas about why he should be doing his work and what he could contribute to society. So the first piece we're going to look at is entitled Guernica. And so Guernica is actually a really out of characteristic painting for Picasso because it was both a political painting as well as a public mural, two things he had not engaged in really prior to creating it. So a little background about Picasso and a little background about the history of what the painting depicts. So first, Picasso was a Spanish artist. He lived all throughout the 20th century. He lived into a pretty long-lived age, and he spent most of his life living in France, although he was a Spanish artist and had Spanish background. He was a bit of a prodigy, so he had displayed great artistic skills at a very early age and went on to study at some very famous academies in order to perfect his skills. He's often regarded as one of the most influential artists of the 20th century, largely because he broke a lot of boundaries, challenged a lot of conventions, and changed the way we see what art could be and what art should do. He co-founded the Cubist movement, one of the very first abstract art movements, and which was really influential on a lot of other movements that kind of progressed throughout the 20th century. He also co-invented collage, right? So that kind of craft activity that we do today, where we kind of take a lot of different magazines or photos and textures and patterns and kind of make crafts with that. That actually was an art form that he developed as a way to try to capture different ways of viewing and creating work, especially with a textual component to it and a fragmented picture plane. What I mean by that is that he divided the plane up so it wasn't flat. It had lots of angles in it, and that was to try to mimic what he thought was a better way of capturing how we see the world around us. So this is Picasso as an artist, and he's approached to create this painting, Guernica. And the history of this painting is that it follows a tragedy that happens during World War II. Okay, so Guernica was a Basque country town in northern Spain. The Basque people were kind of a minority group, a minority people. They had a different appearance, which in terms of like racial or ethnicity, and they also spoke a different language of the rest of Spain. So they were considered kind of outsiders to the rest of the culture of the time. During World War II, the Spanish nationalists had requested Nazi Germany and fascist Italy to help them put down any rebels, as well as these minority groups that were considered kind of, problematic for the overall culture of the day. And so what happened was German and Italian planes came through and they strafed the entire village, destroying all the people with firebombs and killing women, children, the elderly, everyone, right? And just killed anybody who lived in that village, along with all of the animals and other things. And at the end, it was an absolute destruction. And there was really nothing left other than burnt buildings and collapsed buildings and just ash and soot everywhere. So it's this horrible, horrible tragedy. And it really moves Picasso. And so he decides to create this cubist rendition of the situation or of what had happened, right? And interestingly enough, at the time, it wasn't actually very well received. But in subsequent years, it's become a symbol, and it's been invoked in many different circumstances during the Vietnam War, even different battles in World War II, and even today, with the war in Russia and Ukraine. So we can see that the painting speaks to us about the tragedies and the horrors of war when it comes to civilians, when it comes to the innocent. So this picture is also kind of dreamlike in its quality. And so let's take a look at it from a more kind of zoomed in version here. So you'll see here, some of the qualities have like this almost nightmarish kind of depiction, and that was intentional, right? So when we are looking at the choices the artist made here, we're seeing that what Picasso did is he did not represent, say, like a photographic, realistic image of what war or horror was, but instead he wanted to capture the long-lasting and traumatic parts of it. And so they have like this dreamlike quality in that the shapes are very fluid. The people are represented in this way where that they're distorted. We have animals blended in with people. We have body parts and dismembered body parts strewn about. And then the people themselves and the animals themselves are unrealistic, right? They're distorted. They're kind of spread apart. The eyes are kind of out of proportion and out of place. So we have this very, very traumatic kind of way of looking at what has happened. Now, Picasso wanted to create an image that pulled from a lot of his background. So you'll see that there's Cubist influence here in the sense that like we're seeing multiple angles of a person at the same time. So he's taking different views or different angles of a person's face and kind of smushing them together into a single plane. We're seeing the fragmented picture plane with these diagonal cuts where we're taking different kind of images or scenes and kind of stitching them together in awkward ways. We're seeing his use of collage, where he is trying to create these patterns right here in the middle of the painting, which is supposed to emulate newspaper clippings, because at the time the newspapers covered some of this, but it was covered in a very specific way with a lot of bias, and so he was getting commentary on that. He's also thrown in some images such as like this cow or this bull in the top left corner. This is actually reminiscent of a Minotaur, which is a myth out of Greek mythology. And Picasso used the Minotaur throughout his career to represent dreams. He thought that the Minotaur was a really interesting dreamlike thing, as well as a throwback to his Spanish heritage, where the running with the bulls or the bull is kind of associated with Spain. We've got this horse, which is screaming in agony as it's dying, and it's superimposed over people. These faces kind of have like a ghost-like appearance to them, where they're sort of being separated out of their bodies. And even the sun itself has a light bulb in it, symbolizing this kind of blend between the nature as well as this industrial war kind of thing, right? So he's definitely playing with all these images in order to try to evoke a different kind of feeling than if you just seen, say, like photographs of what had happened, right? And he made the argument that he chose to do this in a certain way so that you felt about it, not just thought about it. So there's a few things that we can look at here in terms of those choices where it's black and white, again, emulating that photographs of the day, trying to record the horrors of the war, but also the stark contrast between dark and good, or dark and lightness, right? And that's intended to be, kind of thrown in our face, so we're forced to face the horrors of evil, right? And then other things he did, which is he repeats sort of images and patterns over and over again, trying to show you that not only one person suffered this, an entire town went through a shared communal tragedy. Okay, so from the analysis here, we can go on to interpret what it's supposed to mean, right? And so this has been heralded as one of the great anti-war or anti-genocide sort of artistic paintings. Now, Guernica is really not the only one to do this, right? There's lots of artwork all throughout our history that show kind of the perils of war. But this is the first time that we're seeing one in this way, where it's representing like this nightmarish quality of what war is, and really is speaking to things that aren't actually happening, but are how we feel and how we react and how we interpret what happened, right? And so those are very different kind of models, because typically we see the horrors of war, we see it in a photograph, or we see it in classic paintings, where we're seeing the actual physical act in its realness. This is trying to go above that realness and really try to communicate to us in terms of the themes and in terms of the symbols that are kind of more deeper emotions that we humans feel. So from Picasso's point of view, he's trying to capture that essence of the story, as opposed to just trying to like represent the actual thing that happened, which he said wasn't sufficient enough to show the tragedy. It wasn't sufficient enough to show one or two people who had been harmed or one building collapsed, but that it transcends that, it goes above that. It's even more, it's felt by an entire community of people and really should be felt by the entire world. Okay. So from there, you can start making some other inferences about Picasso's stance on the war, on our commentaries about genocide, our commentaries on Nazi Germany, our commentaries on fascism, right? There's a whole kind of way of looking at the history of that war from a different perspective. Like we often look at it from in terms of, mobilization and number of troops and tanks and the machinery and land that's conquered. We tend to think of war in those ways, especially in our history books. And Picasso's forcing us to look at war in a human way and looking at it from the human perspective. So those are ways to take a look at Guernica. Now we could put this in context of Picasso in terms of his progression as an artist. So throughout his life, Picasso went through different periods. He kind of focused on different styles, color palettes, emotions, and those kinds of things. And the idea for Picasso was he was always push himself as an artist and break new ground and break boundaries. Okay? So in a lot of ways, Picasso represents all of art and art history. Art history goes through these different periods through time, and it's a lot of like an evolution and revolution, right? So things grow and change as reactions to the previous period, but then there's a lot of revolution where we try revolutionary ideas or revolt against what's happened in the past and challenge it and come up with something brand new. So you can see that even in Picasso's work himself. Part of this is because he lived so long, but also because he was this experimenter who was willing to push the boundaries of things. I also think it's because he was such a talented guy, right? He had a very strong classic painting background. So he was able then to mess around and kind of play with things in a way that had some merit to it, right? Because it was saying, well, I can do it the way you want me to, but I'm refusing to, right? So that's a very different statement than saying, well, I don't know how to do it the way you want me to, so I'm going to do it this way instead. He was making a choice to refuse the conventions of the day. So we can look back at his blue period, which the Old Man with a Guitar is a great example of. We actually can see this here in Chicago if you go to the Art Institute. We have this in that collection. So Old Man with a Guitar is a very technically well done painting. Proportions are correct. The value and the shading are used well in terms of the light source. But what he has done is he's played with color. And what he was trying to do in the blue period was capture the emotional quality of the time. So a lot of depression, sadness, poverty, right? So in the early 1900s, if you know where Picasso's living in Spain and in France, there was a lot of poverty, a lot of issues that were going on, especially in urban areas. And so he was reflecting that in the blue period. And that's really what he was trying to go for. So already he's challenging conventions because he's refusing to represent the person with the correct color palette. He decided to use an emotional color palette as opposed to a realistic color palette, right? So that's early on in his career. That's early on in the 1900s. After the blue period, he moves into what's the rose period, where it is often seen as kind of like a romantic period. He uses a lot of reds and pinks and kind of rose-colored palettes, which often people think is, it's a contrast to the blue period. So the rose period is the happy period. It's not necessarily that. It's more about the passion and the emotion that's felt. You'll see, though, kind of remnants of the blue period in the rose period. For instance, Boy with Pipe, which is a really great example of the rose period, it has still blue in it, right? It has that blue color palette. The rose period isn't meant to be a happy period. It's meant to be an emotional period, just a different kind of emotions than necessarily the blue period. It's also meant to show, kind of celebrate whimsy. There's a lot of like clowns and those kinds of things. So he's trying to represent a different aspect of human feeling. But it's not happiness, because clowns themselves can also be sad, can also be silly in a way that kind of makes us uncomfortable, right? And so often with the rose period, you'll find those kinds of feelings being conveyed. Then this is where Picasso really starts to break things down. So as he moves into the mid-1900s and into the kind of further into his career, he starts to develop this thing with other artists, especially George Seurat, this idea of Cubism. And one of the very earliest examples of Cubism comes from the young ladies of Avignon. So you'll see I have a kind of a close-up of this painting. It's a little bit larger and has other figures in it. But he's already starting to break the boundaries of what we see. Now, here's what's interesting about Cubism. Cubism is meant to show multifaceted versions of a person. So that's why the eyes often look out of place or the noses look out of place. It's because those are the eyes or noses that you'd see in versus profile. So a person kind of looking from the side. And what he's done is he's put them on a person who is in full front or three-quarter view. So he's broken the rules of proportion and placement. But to show you, right, if you compare this to the Rose period or the Blue period, he knows how to do it. He's actually very gifted at doing it correctly. He is intentionally breaking the way we see things. And his argument is that's how the eye perceives the world. The eye does not perceive the world in one version, one flat way. The eye perceives the world in three dimensions. And he says, why do we take paintings and try to make it only from one angle when we as people, we as humans, see things from multiple points of view? Now, what that opens up is not just the visual, but also the emotional, the spiritual, the mental, and the psychological. Because humans, again, we don't just see things or feel things in one way. We do it in multiple ways, right? We're a very multifaceted sort of creature. And so he's trying to capture that. So what's interesting is Picasso's already breaking some conventions of how we see things. Okay, now in this painting, it continues to push some boundaries in that he's displaying the nudity, which in itself really wasn't that rare, right? Nudity is all throughout our history. But oftentimes when poses were created for nude models, they were done so in what we kind of think of as like more tasteful or more elegant way, where these are very provocative, right? The arms are open, the legs are open, the bodies are open. We usually see nudity in a much more closed way. And then, again, he's doing this intentionally. He's intentionally trying to make us comfortable and trying to say, why do we always portray nudity in this one way, this more like, elegant way or this heroic way, oftentimes in like Greek sculpture, these things. Why do we portray it that way when nudity can be very carnal and very raw and very savage? And so he portrays the women in this way. He actually went to a brothel and painted different women at the brothel. In fact, the original title of this painting was Brothel of Avignon, not the Young Ladies of Avignon. Now, one more thing that he does, which is very controversial for the day, is that he incorporates non-Western art into this painting. So what is he doing? He's looking at things like masks and sculptures and small kinds of carvings made in Africa and Oceania, where these are peoples that were not Western peoples, right? These are peoples that are indigenous folks. And the way they stylized things for Picasso was very interesting. And so he takes those masks and he puts them on these whores, these people who live, these prostitutes, in the brothel, which is very controversial because now we're seeing this kind of blend of cultures, which at the time of the day was not acceptable, right? I mean, at the early 1900s, right? We have issues of race, we have issues of gender and identity, and all those things are rampant at this time period across the world. And he's definitely, breaking those conventions, and then doing so in a very provocative way. This painting elicits really terrible critique from a lot of the art critics of the day and of other artists. And they mocked him for it because it looked silly to them. They said, either it was offensive and obscene or it was goofy and like, why would you do this, right? But for Picasso, it was a way to challenge and break those conventions. These three kind of movements, I think, really help us understand Guernica in the sense that, right, Guernica is trying to bring in those three kinds of things. It's the emotions of the Blue period, the kind of forcing us to look at things in an uncomfortable way of the Rose period, but also dealing with a different set of emotions of the Rose period, and then breaking things down in this like Cubist way where you're blending things in uncomfortable ways and forcing us to deal with a topic that people at the time were not coping with, we're not dealing with, and turn a blind eye to. And people of today, we're still dealing with these same kinds of problems, right? And so what's really interesting is that if you compare and contrast Guernica to the other movements, the other paintings of Picasso's work, it actually makes a lot of sense that this is where he ends up in his career. And it really makes a lot of sense. This is the way he created this painting of a tragedy. He's pulling from his past experiences and his past methods of communicating in the arts to make a bold, bold statement. And that is really what Guernica becomes. So as you're looking through Guernica and trying to analyze it and interpret for its meanings, it's probably a good idea to consider all the other parts of what makes Picasso the artist that he is. All right, I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you've got questions, please reach out, and thanks for watching.